Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking to you about startups and open source, and in particular about more than just the benefits you get from open source in engineering. And I'm the founder of Server Density. I've been going for over 6 years now. I started back in 2009, and we help our customers monitor their server environments. We monitor the internals of servers, and we also monitor the availability from different locations around the world. We've built our technology stack on a number of different open source products. We use Nginx, we use Linux, of course, we use MongoDB, and I'm going to go into some of these as examples as not just a user of these technologies, but how we've been able to make use of them for various benefits to the business. What I'm not going to go through is kind of the standard open source benefits that you're probably all aware of. The things like no license costs, having a mature ecosystem so that you can get features developed as you need them, or bug fixes dealt with, and also access to the source code. These are all kind of standard benefits that have been talked about for years in open source. And so I want to go through some of the more unusual benefits that you might be able to get as a business. The first way I want to frame one of the major benefits is by looking at what it costs to recruit engineers. Now, to bring in a recruiter, an outside recruiter, to hire into your company, it's usually around 20 to 25% of that engineer's salary. And so if you look at the fully loaded cost of hiring a brand new engineer, that 20 to 25% on a senior engineer, whether it's pounds or euros or dollars, it adds up to a significant cost. There's the fees from the recruiter itself, and if you add on all the things that you have to buy for any employee, and then you're looking at 100K plus for the first year. And if you're using a developer recruiter, then there's also a hit on your reputation. And so at Server Density, we've been able to hire our entire technical team without using recruiters. And just to illustrate that cost on your reputation, imagine all those emails that you've received, those LinkedIn requests from recruiters trying to poach you away. And this example from Twitter just a few days ago from David Heinemeier Hansson, who's the creator of Ruby on Rails, obviously doesn't need a job because of his work on Basecamp. But the negative hit on the reputation that the company who hired a recruiter to try and take him away from his core project. And this is because the best developers are not really actively looking for a new job. They probably already have a job that they actually really like, and they're not going to be using recruiters, because when they do decide that they want to have a new challenge, maybe there's family reasons, or for some reason they need to change their job, then they're really only going to apply to 1 or 2 positions. They're going to maybe passively browse the job market, build up a profile of the kind of companies that they want to work for, and then just apply to 1 or 2 when they happen to be recruiting at that right time. And so the key here is to be noticed by these developers as the kind of place that people really want to work at. And the first one of these is actually being able to work on interesting problems. You can't do this 100% of the time, but at most companies there are projects always going on that the best developers want to be working on and are interesting. Often because this is they're being deployed at large scale. The problems that Facebook and Google are trying to solve are very interesting, but your own companies probably have at least one area within your product or the market that you're trying to solve that hits at large scale. And dealing with these kind of problems when you're trying to scale software and infrastructure are very interesting because they're hard. And also having a modern software stack is really important here too. Being able to work as your primary job on interesting new technologies is a great benefit, and not having to maintain legacy code bases on old technologies. And of course, this is the best case scenario. There's always going to be legacy components in your application stack. But trying to push your company forward by using new tools, new services in interesting new projects, or replacing old components where it makes sense. Really makes it a great place for developers to work. And also giving both responsibility and involvement so that the developers, the engineers are picking the technologies that they want to use. And they can be involved in making those decisions. So building that reputation as a place where developers want to work is done through a number of different aspects. And I'm obviously showing this as an example here, speaking at conferences and talking about what it is that we do. But open source fits in there as well, as does content. And I'll come back to content shortly. But open source is really key as well, because it allows you to put your work out in the public and be able to talk about that by writing content, explaining the problems that you're solving, and then presenting at conferences. It not only builds your own personal reputation, but as a company, it builds a reputation for dealing with large-scale, hard and interesting problems. And so hiring is really that first advantage that using open source software has given us. If you look at our job ad for one of the last jobs that we were hiring for, and you zoom in on the bullet points where we talk about why we think server density is a great place to work, we're trying to hit all those different points. There's scale, and we've got an interesting modern software stack, but also there's open source software there. Well, server density is an agent-based monitoring product, and a core part of our technology, the agent itself, is open source. And there are a number of reasons for that, such as not wanting to install stuff on your servers that you can't have a look at the source code for, but also so that we can take advantage of being able to get help from the community, show people what is actually going on behind the scenes and be able to write about that. Now, when you're actually in the selection process for bringing a new employee on board, then open source is a really useful part of that for the initial parts. So the CV screen, once someone has applied and you're looking through their CV, particularly for technical roles, being able to look at the relevant experience that they've listed, and then backing that up with actual real contributions, whether that's code on GitHub, or their contributions to documentation, perhaps, for a project. Maybe they've done a number of talks. If they haven't done code contributions, perhaps they've talked about their involvement in the project. And it really gives the candidate credibility. And it makes it a lot easier to review and find those good engineers. And it can be difficult to sift through the CVs. Open source as job references. You've probably all talked to references provided by candidates and maybe sourced your own references, but actually looking at the code that someone has written, reviewing that quality for yourself to see whether it fits in with your own understanding of what you think good code looks like, or whether it's adhering to best practices, allows you to use open source software as a reference within the recruitment process. You can also see and measure quantitatively their contribution to the community and how popular a project is. And of course, this is the ultimate goal for anyone who releases open source software, is to have millions of people using it. And not everyone can really attain that, but even if your project is just used by 1 or 2 people, you can call that a success because something you've written is useful to someone else. And being able to use this as a reference when you're hiring someone to show that they can write good quality code that other people want to use is actually really useful as kind of a backup reference to understand whether you should hire someone or not. So then the next benefit is about building product features. Every company has limited resources. No matter how large you are, you're really always constrained by resources and the number of people that you have, how much money, how much time you can spend on a particular thing. But hopefully you have some kind of open APIs or open part of your product, which means that other people can contribute to it. Because it results in people building additional projects on top of your own product. It might be things that you just haven't got around to doing yet that a customer really wants. Having these open APIs, having an open project means that customers can build product features for you. And then once they've done that, because it's open source, you can obviously adopt that and you can take their work thank them for it in various ways, but then you can make it official. And there are many examples of projects that have been done just as side projects and have then perhaps been acquired by a big company or just brought in-house. The person who developed them has been hired. But by producing these open APIs, it means that you can let the community, let your customers decide what is useful to them. And as an example from server density, this is the GitHub repository for our chef cookbook. And if you look down at the authors, the first author was a customer, and then it was modified by another customer. And at that point, when we saw the popularity, we adopted it internally and decided to make it our official cookbook. Then it was modified by another customer and actually completely rewritten into a much more modern cookbook, and then again modified by another customer. And this is all because of the license that that the original author chose when doing this. This is great if that person happens to move on and is no longer interested in maintaining it, or it becomes too popular. But it's a great example of our customers using our APIs, building a product feature that we then took on board, made it official, and is now a major part of the product. So then the third part of this is more on the marketing side of things. And our customers are engineers and developers. And the way that we've tried to approach this is to create interesting things for them so that it's useful on its own, but a side effect is that it's come from server density. And when they're thinking about whether they need monitoring or not, we will come to mind and they can evaluate us. So the biggest, most important thing that I've probably done over the last 6 years is to have a lot of problems within the product, but then solve them and talk about how they've been solved. And this is initially done just by writing on our blog. We've written numerous topics about all sorts of the different technical problems that we've had, from when we were just processing 50 gig of data a month to now where we're processing almost 300 terabytes of data a month. And these are interesting problems, and it's actually surprising how many other people have these problems too. And many companies consider these internal things as proprietary, but really they're not. And you can actually talk about them and help other companies, help other people with the same kind of problems. And then you can just increase your brand awareness as a result of that. We also like to share our best practices and share what we think is a best practice. And this is also useful within the operations community, and DevOps in particular is a fairly new idea that a lot of companies don't know much about. And because as a small company, we're doing this already, and perhaps if you're in a large company, you might be doing it in a small area and you want to talk about it. The benefit from our perspective is that we can just do it. If you're a large company, you can use your name to try and promote it. And also being an early adopter of technologies. We've used MongoDB in production since 2009. We're pretty much the first in production usage of MongoDB. And we've used it for a very long time and have had a lot of problems with it and solved those problems. And being an early adopter of a technology that has then become very popular has allowed us to spend several years worth of time talking about MongoDB, speaking at conferences, and becoming known in the community for helping people with that because we're talking about the problems that we've had. And if you go on blog.serverdensity.com, you can see probably over 100 articles that my team and myself have written about the problems that we've had with MongoDB and how we've been able to solve them. And this is the same for any technology. It doesn't have to be MongoDB. It's mature now. We find less and less we're talking about it. But there are always new shiny technologies, containers and Docker, for example. That's incredibly interesting and exciting right now, but there are very few people using it in production. Perhaps if you were to deploy an application into production using Docker and you were writing about the problems that you're having, then you could be able to use exactly the same methodology. And it's the same with any technology. There'll be others that come along too. And this really attracts potential customers, but also potential employees, because you're on the leading edge talking about new technologies. And just to take a few examples as use cases for how we've done this, this is the homepage from our blog just a couple of days ago. I took the screenshot. And most of the content is technical and going into details about how we've done different things. So for example, this is a blog post about our MongoDB servers and showing off some of the specs and how we deploy things, how the cluster is set up, just because it's a fairly large cluster and people are interested in those numbers. Sharing those best practices, how we do our on-call rotations. There's newer ways of doing things and different ways that different companies adopt, and we're just saying how we do it. Other people, this might seem standard to us, but it's new and unusual for other people, and so it helps us in our marketing. And then just those standard 10 ways, 15 ways to do X, Y, or Z. And the point of these is not to get the link bait title, but to actually have realistic points in there that people can go through and follow. And this is how to do security, and is one of our most popular articles. And then also suggesting change within the industry. One of the things that we've taken from our DevOps principles is a number of ideas from the aviation industry. Checklists, we use the sterile cockpit rule, and a number of other things that are standard in aviation but are completely new in operations. And so by taking these over into our own usage and then writing about them, I've spoken about this topic now at 3 different conferences because it's novel and new. And whilst it's not open source as such, it is open. It's being open about the things that we're doing, the things that we're trying, and allows people to hopefully make changes, get ideas for improvements. So in summary, you've really got those standard open source benefits that everybody really knows: the free license fees, the access to free software, the community and the bug fixes and all that kind of stuff. But there are also other benefits that your company can get from using open source specifically, or taking inspiration from open source. It helps with the recruiting, which is incredibly expensive and time consuming. Finding good candidates, using open source to do that, to build up your profile and to show what you're building and maybe use that as a recruiting tool is really useful. It also helps with your product. A number of features of our product are now official, having been built by the community. You can hire people specifically, you can acquire products, or you can just provide open APIs and let people build on top of that. And it also helps with the marketing side of things. Talking about problems specific to your industry, talking about problems specific to technologies, it really helps with the other 2 as well. Thank you very much.